I'm joined today by a fellow Aussie, Victor Coleiro. He's helped with a lot of kind of uncovering a lot of the background to the Lazar story. And he's also appeared on Steve Campion's show Truth Seekers. He's also got his own channel, but I think you haven't really updated that in a few years. And you've also got a Twitter account that I hope I can share, but I'll put that in the description. So Victor, sorry, did I get your last name right?
It's close enough. It's Coleiro, but whatever.
Coleiro. Okay, I'm sorry. Um, can you tell us kind of how you got interested in the Lazar story and what sort of drew you to it, I guess?
Yeah, so through the beginning of the pandemic, basically, we all sort of got locked in Melbourne, particularly. We got hit pretty hard with all the lockdowns. So I don't know what I saw, to be honest. I don't know what I saw to even get me to know about the Bob Lazar story. Like, I don't recall knowing his story from the past, like many other people would have maybe remember his story from back in the day. I don't have a recollection of it. There was something I saw during I guess, the beginning of the pandemic, and then maybe it was Jeremy's film. I don't know, but yeah, because we were locked down, and I was just curious and couldn't do really much anyway. So I guess my curiosity sort of led me to dig deeper into it, and it wasn't to debunk the story. It was just because I was, like a lot of people, I was fascinated by it, and I just wanted to learn more about it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Had you been into that story or other UFO stories in the 1990s when they were really at their height?
No, I don't think I've ever heard of any. I haven't even heard of, at that point, I hadn't even heard of the UFO stories here in Australia.
Hmm.
Later when you sort of get into this, you hear about this other stuff, and you hear about these Australian cases, and because they're local, you get interested in them. And I hadn't even heard of them, so
Mm-hmm.
you're really coming into it raw.
Yep. So who are some of the people in the Lazar story that you've spoken to, if you could reveal that you think are the most important players?
So when I started getting into it, so it was just more of a quest to learn more, and then I think I met Dan Benkert online at one point, really early on. And then I was just sort of absorbing the information that was out there. Everyone, you see Tom Mayhood stuff, and you see this, and just trying to get an understanding of all of the information that was out there, and gathering it all, and it sort of like steamrolls, and then you have questions, and you try to find more information on those questions, and steamrolls from there. Then you get to the point where you understand his story, and you try to validate the story, or no, just find more about the story, and then you perhaps have questions that go unanswered, and then from there we interviewed some other people, myself. So then branching out from just looking at other people's research to then doing some yourself, where I spoke to. So I had an email exchange with T.D. Barnes. He made it very clear. It was his perspective was he didn't believe Lazar at all, and he thought, if I remember correct, that him and his Area 51 buddies thought it was a bit of a joke. If people don't know, T.D. Barnes is someone who worked at Area 51 quite a way back now, and he became the president of the Area 51 veterans, I guess, people that used to work there or whatever. So that went on from there. I then interviewed Fred Dunham, Fred Dunham, who was an Area 51 security guard during before Bob's time, and through Bob's time, and after Bob's time. He was actually quite sick. He's one of these people that was exposed to burn pits in Area 51.
He sued the government, right?
Yeah, he's got some legal things going on with the government. I didn't delve much deep into it because I didn't really want to upset him with my interview with him. But you can find, if you type in his name, you can see the news clippings, news articles about it. Yeah, and he basically said that he checked the manifest at Area 51 and his historical manifest, and there's no Lazar on it. Take what you will out of that. But he also told me that in his days at Area 51 that he'd been to Papoose. So not Area 51, he'd gone around the other side of the range, and he'd gone around, walked around there, and he was like, "Look, there's no secret base there. There's nothing going on there except maybe, a little hut or something that they had some electronic equipment in. That was basically it." He then told me that he spoke to George Knapp sometime, and he had told him all this, but I'd never seen George Knapp repeat Fred's story, so I don't know what happened to that. Who else did I speak to? I spoke to, through Tom Mayhood. Oh, that's right. I started to then try to get information of Tom Mayhood, and that was a bit odd, but I won't say much about that. But eventually he did divulge information. Tom at that point had walked away from all this Lazar stuff. He doesn't, he doesn't want anything to do with it, basically. So it was very difficult to sort of get him to talk and get information out of it, but he did in the end. I think he was the one that gave me Carol Lazar's death certificate, which no one had except him. And they changed the rules, from memory, that if you wanted to obtain it, you had to actually go there and prove that you were a family member. Of course, you're not. So unless I could get it out of Tom, it was going to be really difficult. So it took absolute ages communicating and asking him. And eventually, I think it was Tom. I think it was Tom that eventually gave it to him. It's going back now. But that's when I saw a few things. For one, there was a rumor that the social security number on Bob Lazar's W-2 was Carol's. It wasn't, because I could see Carol's social security number, and it's not the same. And then from there, I thought, well, okay, can you validate the social security number on Bob's W-2? And I found the way. I won't say how, because I don't want the door to close on the how, as these things tend to happen, if you know what I mean. There's been things like videos I've linked to that were not well known that you link to, and then suddenly they're gone. You talk about them and they're gone, copyright strike or something. But anyway, there's a way that you could. It's a very simple way, and that I was able to search his social security number, and it did come up, and it is Bob's. So I can confirm that the social security number on Bob's W-2 is his. Everything else on it, obviously, is very questionable.
And you mentioned the guy who worked, who checked the manifest at Area 51. He because Lazar claims that he was flying in on the McCarran flights, right? As he was like in transit to S4, and then he would take a bus ride from Area 51 to S4. So basically, I mean, he says that he didn't work at Area 51 proper, but that he worked at S4. So yeah, he himself claimed that he was flying in on the McCarran flights. So yeah, that makes sense that if he's not on the manifest, then there's no way he could have gotten into the base, right?
That's right. So that's the gateway. So the reason it's an issue of him not having access to Area 51 is that he had to go through there to get to. And I think there was also a story where he claimed that he ate lunch at Area 51 once or twice.
Yeah.
So yeah, and then he would grab a bus down to this S4 at Papoose. Fred also told me that that road that goes from Area 51 to Papoose is rough as guts, and there's no way a bus would go down it. So that was another reason. He said it's just, not true, basically. Actually, I was doing some investigation at one point. It's a really interesting area, that all that area around, that greater area, if you like, where they have all those salt lakes.
Yep.
But there's always these dirt trails to all of them. Every single one had a dirt trail. So it's not unique in that sense. So I don't know what tests. And then where Papoose is, that dry lake. So you got Area 51, there's like what do you call it? A mountain ridge or a range or whatever you call it, that separates Area 51 from Papoose Lake.
Yeah.
Where Bob said their secret base was on the thing. But then over one more ridge, if you like, into the next valley is where they did all the atomic bomb testing.
Yes.
And there's just cratered to extremes with all these atomic bomb tests.
Yeah, the Nevada test site. You can see that on Google, all the subduction craters.
Yeah.
So I wonder, like, even that area would even be safe to work at for a long time. Wouldn't you get some radiation exposure potentially?
I heard that they cleaned it up and that there was some.
Okay.
I'm not sure if it's lethal, but yeah, I think if you're planning a base, you probably wouldn't put it just one ridge over, from where they're doing the atomic bombs. So.
And how do you think that Lazar got some of those operational details about, like, say, the McCarran flights and potentially the name S4? Because he knew this guy called Jim Tagliani, didn't he? Who was a electronics technician at Tonopah Test Range, and that apparently there was a Site 4 there from old maps. But do you think he could have gotten those sorts of details from his friends?
Yeah, so you're right. He said that his friend Jim Tagliani, who he worked with at Fairchild, I think.
He actually worked with him?
That's what he claimed, and I think that was the claim in the Wired article about Desert Blast, and they interviewed both Jim Tagliani and Bob. Sure, that's how they knew each other, or they may have known each other before that, but I think it claimed that they worked together at Fairchild. But yeah, Bob had claimed that Jim Tagliani worked at Tonopah Test Range, and as we know from the Drive article, Tonopah Test Range used that bone scanner, which is called the Identimat 2000, which has been around forever. I did some historical sort of research on it, and it's been around, I think, since 1969. I even found articles on it from 1972. So, well before Close Encounters. People like to say, I was in Close Encounters, but it was around way before then. So, yeah, Bob said that Jim had worked at Tonopah Test Range, and they had the bone scanner there, according to the Drive article. And they also had a Site 4. And that Site 4, which was explained to me, and which I looked up, was where is an area. And one of the Area 51 or something like that YouTube channels, he actually went there and he's got a video recording of it.
Yeah.
It's just a plane with some things sticking out of the ground. There's not much to see. But that was interesting. But yeah, Site 4, as it explained to me, was where they had foreign nation radar systems and their own radar systems, where they used to fly the aircraft over to see exactly what radar signature would be picked up from them. Because that area, Tonopah, Area 51, they're doing their secret craft and they're testing them or whatever, the airplanes. So it makes sense that they want to test them to see, how much radar signature would be detected on a Russian radar system.
Yeah.
I actually heard that. That was a specific one example that was given to me, was they had Russian radar systems there. So you got two things. You got Bob saying Jim worked at TTR, And that at TTR they had the bone scanner, and at TTR they had the Site 4. So
Yeah.
if you're skeptical, you you know where your mind's going to lead to from that. Well, the other thing you don't know how much he got out of was obviously John Lear.
Yeah.
And John Lear was sort of, researching that area. And at the time, I think he had the closest photograph of Area 51. That's, I think Jeremy Corbell showed at one point. So I'm quite, I'm guessing, but I'm assuming John Lear knew a lot about Area 51. And as you know, as the story goes, supposedly Bob Lazar met John Lear. John Lear showed him the Billy Meyer tape.
Yeah.
With the saucer that looks exactly like, or not exactly, but very similar to Bob's sports model UFO. And just take a step back, in 1987, so before Bob even claimed to have worked at S4, John Lear was on George Knapp's show, talking about how the government had 9 sources, was it? I forget now.
Something like that, yeah.
One of them they could fly or tried to fly. So you could see the nucleus.
Yes.
And all these other areas of where the story might have come from, or where it pieces together. And then later you hear that Bob Lazar and Gene Huff met John Lear, who showed them the Billy Myers tape, who told him his story, I'm sure. So you could, and I think he gave him all his UFO files in exchange for Gene Huff doing a house appraisal, because Gene Huff was a property appraiser. And so you can, and at that time, John Lear was not just on George Knapp's show talking about UFOs and all this stuff, but I think he was doing the tour, like going to different centers and speaking about it as well. You know, something about Gene Huff and Bob having known about John Lear, and that's why they got in contact with him to learn more about it. So
there was also the 1988 TV special UFO Cover Up Live that had a ton of tropes that Lazar obviously copied. There was also a mention of the name Area 51 in that TV special. This was the year before Lazar came out with his story. Do you know of any other references to the name Area 51?
Oh, yeah. I mean, people keep saying, that he had got the name out. Go and have a look at the news clippings. I saw news clippings from 1981 talking about Area 51. It was well known. Oh, not well known, but, he was, out there. But, so, yeah, I mean, there's all these little bits. Like people talk about the element 115, but just weeks before he came out with that story, when he came out as Dennis in the Silhouette, I always get this wrong. It's either Scientific American or American Scientist. I always forget which way it is. Or Scientific American, whichever way.
American, yeah.
Yeah. I can never remember which one it is. But anyway, yeah, as you know, they'd come up with that story about the search for heavy elements ranging from E114 to E116, I think. So, I mean, coincidence? Just weeks before he comes out with his story? Yeah. But what's interesting about who is it? Someone wrote a book about their meeting with Bob and their interview with him. What was his name?
Michael Lindemann?
Yes. Yes, and there's a bit in there where they were saying, I think it was that Lindemann book, or it could be another book, where they were saying that Bob wasn't even sure whether it was E115 or E114.
Right.
It was absolutely amazing. I'm going, what? Didn't he say he found it? Like,
yeah,
he
was supposedly the one
that it was E115. So, if the Lindemann story interview was correct, he's telling them that he wasn't sure whether it was E114 or E115, somewhere around that, I think was the wording, which is amazing. And that goes to when there was interesting bit about those sort of things is people say, oh, he's never changed his story, but
No, it's changed a ton of times.
yeah, it's sort of like I don't want to dive too much. I don't want to put him in a negative light, but it's kind of like the Brussels thing, sort of like, well, I only installed the computer system there, but then he pled guilty. Is that a change of story?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So, and then not only that, he said, Art Bell or Billy Goodman or one of those, that, okay, I did own a brothel, but it was in 1985, mid 80s, and it was a legal one. So, you got this progression. You got three different stories. Well, not different. They're not different. Technically, the first two are not. The first one and the third are not different. But I didn't own that illegal brothel I got pinged with. I pled guilty to it. Okay, I did own a brothel, but it was a legal one in 1985, not that one. Or, I did own one in 1985. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
So when you see those sort of things and people say, oh, he's never changed his story, like, yeah, you don't really know what happened. That's the thing about Bob's story, because so much time has gone by. A lot of that research was done a long time ago, and a lot of the facts, like that document from the Navy where someone had tried, was it John Andrews or John Andrews, isn't it? The testers guy that did the model of Bob's
Oh,
UFO.
yeah.
He wrote into the Navy to try and get some verification on Bob's W2, and they came back and they said, well, first of all, it's typed red, which is a red flag. Second of all, it notes the Department of Naval Intelligence, which doesn't exist, which is so. But that letter that he got from the Navy saying all that, you have to dig for that. It's not open. You'll never see George Knapp saying, hey, remember this?
Yeah.
You're not telling you all this stuff. Or that letter from the IRS saying, oh, yes, there's the employer number. We can't find the employer number that you gave us that was on Bob's W2. That letter exists. You can go and find it. You won't see that in Jeremy Corbell's documentary. You won't see the Navy letter from,
Mm-hmm.
you won't get a deep dive on Site 4 on Tonopah Test Range.
Yeah.
So, yeah, there's all these things that are there deep in the background that have been discovered way back, what was it, 30 years ago. Pretty, major red flags.
So what about the him and Gene Huff and I think Leah went out to the desert a couple of times, and one of the claims you often hear is that they filmed the flying saucers being tested, and but it's just like a little dot, like a little faint dot, which could be really anything. But what do you think
Yeah,
that was what that video footage was capturing?
could be one of the headlights from the Janet flight, the landing lights, I should say. It could be one of the aircraft they were testing. Could have been flares. Bob himself at a Rachel conference in '93 said they were firing up flares over in that area with parachutes. Those parachute flares.
Hmm.
Who knows? It's it's Area 51. They're flying shit over there. It could be anything. So, but the interesting thing was that he told Norio.
Yeah,
How do you say his last name? How was
it's a
Zaka?
Japanese name, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, but I spoke to Norio online quite a bit. Um, they he oh well, there's a bit of it. Maybe I should. How do I start the Norio story? Okay, so this is what Norio told me and what he's written as well. Bob, he arranged with someone else that Rachel '93 conference where Bob spoke. the famous one, where there's a videotape of. And he was telling me that either at that time or some other previous time, he saw Bob was sort of laughing at other UFO speakers, didn't you know, which he thought was odd. And then it came to that 1993 Rachel conference, whatever, Q&A or whatever, what do you want to call it? And Bob rolled up in his Corvette with Majestic or Madge 12 or whatever, because, you know, trying to keep a low profile. And he was in tow with some good-looking women or something. And he gave that speech, and Norio was somehow connected with, or made contact with Nippon TV. And they were doing some UFO special in Japan. And they got Norio to hook them up with Bob Lazar. And they went to the US and interviewed Japan. If you go onto Norio's channel, you see he's got a little video of him and the Nippon TV crew going into a house. And then there's Gene Huff there, and he's got the old brick mobile phone or whatever it was, blast from the past. And, you know, they end up talking to Bob Lazar. But there was a second half to that agreement, and Bob Lazar was meant to go to Japan and give a live interview on their show, which is about UFOs and things. And it doesn't, and Norio goes to the airport and waits for Bob to come. He doesn't come. Then you find out that there's this story that Bob Lazar said, oh, I think it was Dennis Mariani or something like that, threatened me, or someone rang him up and threatened him and said if he goes to Japan, there'll be serious consequences or something to that effect. So he doesn't go to Japan anyway. But I found the tape, and you've probably seen it, of the Nippon TV thing, and they're pretty pissed off that he didn't turn up. And they hold, well, that's what I gleaned from it. Maybe they weren't, I don't know. But they hold it. The very first thing they do is they film like the airport terminal with people coming out, and then they sort of lingo on the gate where no one's coming out, and you think, And then they talk about Bob Lazar not turning up, and they hold up his contract, right, that they have with him, and you can see it's signed by Bob. And then they talk about it's dubbed as well, because they're talking in Japanese, and then there's English dubbing and all this sort of stuff. They talk about how Bob didn't turn up. And eventually they ring Bob up on the phone. So he doesn't turn up, but they call him. And he starts telling him the same story, that someone rang him up and threatened him. And they're like, well, if that's true, if someone threatened you, wouldn't you be more at risk staying in America than coming to Japan? And he's like, it's the most awkward conversation you've ever seen. I was laughing, to be honest. It's like, why can't American interviewers be like this? And then right at the end, at the most, they tell him that they don't believe him. They don't believe him. Shit, it's not going down. It more or less ends there. But yeah, that's the whole Norio thing. But going back to where we were going with your question, Bob told Norio and the Nippon TV crew when they were here where to go and see that UFO. So whatever it was happening regularly, not just when he took Tracy in that, because they actually filmed it, and it was just, again, just a light in the sky. So yeah, it didn't just happen at that time where he supposedly took Tracy and Gene Huff and John Lear and Jim Tagliani. There was 3 times, I think. But it also happened after his story came out that he said, yeah, go down. You can see the light yourself. If you were going to say, okay, they were testing UFOs out there, and when Bob's story comes out, and then they still keep flying the UFOs out there, you know.
Right.
You know what I mean? Obviously, if you were looking at it logically, that says to you, okay, it's probably just whatever they're doing, some aircraft or whatever it is, or whatever they're testing out there. Maybe they're testing drones, who knows? But it just doesn't add up that they would just keep flying top secret alien craft over there, even after his story came out. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. What do you
So
think of Tom Mayhood's idea of that it was Lazar has sort of cooked up the story about aliens because he'd stumbled on some particle beam weapon that was like ionizing the atmosphere?
oh, the proton beam theory. Yeah, I mean, look, I'm not saying that it wasn't it, but if you're going to ask me, I don't know. It just seems a bit out there.
Mm-hmm.
I think there was just some terrestrial thing, whether it was drones, flares, aircrafts, whatever they're testing out in that area, you know, or even the Janet flights coming in on you know, as per clockwork as they did, because you knew the Janet, you know, if you were, even went out that area. And there was a story that Signal Intelligence, who you know,
Yeah.
put out saying that Bob had done the rounds going around Area 51 at one point. So was he casing it to see what was going on and what times? You know what I mean? I did, going back to the Fairchild thing, I did speak to one of the people that worked at Fairchild when Bob was there. He just validated that Bob was there, and Bob, not just Bob, but his first wife, Carol, was also there, and they were both electronic technicians. One of them was testing the boards, and one of them was fixing them or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
He noted that there was a large age gap between them, which he thought was weird, which we now know was about 17 years, but you know, whatever. He said that Bob brought in his jet car one day to show them all in the parking lot, and he remembered that. And he had a vague memory that Bob might have still been doing night classes at Pierce Community College, or Pierce College, whatever it is. And I think that was basically it, other than he thought Bob was still there in 1981, which I think was when the year he left. So somehow Bob goes from having a marriage certificate listing him as electronics engineer in 1980, mid 1980, and I think, wasn't it, remind me again, but wasn't it the marriage certificate that also said that he didn't have anything higher than high school certification?
Yeah, I think so.
But anyway, he goes from that to almost exactly 2 years later, supposedly working as a physicist in Los Alamos National Laboratory, with all of a sudden 2 degrees and 2 masters. While he's also working at Fairchild, allegedly, at least until 1981, as an electronics technician. And then he works at Lanham. And as you saw from Signal's investigation, where he spoke to a physicist and the building manager, and I think maybe there was others, I don't know. They both said that no, Bob was a electronic technician there. So you got that. But then people's, so he's working for Kirk Meyer at Lanham. And this is something that people need to understand, because when they hear Lanham, I get the impression that people think, oh, Los Alamos National Laboratory, there's this building, and people work there, and he worked there, he must have worked for Lanham. That's a completely false picture, because Lanham is like the size of a city, and it's got technical areas that are the size of small towns that do different things. It is huge, and there's multiple agencies and contract agencies working out there. So you got this massive area, basically, with all these technical areas, these size of small towns, with all these different agencies working there, with a group of people who work directly for Lanel themselves, right? But there's all these others working there too. So Bob was a contractor working for Kirk Meyer, and people talk about, well, you know, he proved he worked at Lanel because he showed the phone directory, which is interesting in itself, because every time you see the phone directory listing for Bob, it always zooms in on Bob's name and the phone number, but not that extra bit at the end of it that says KM Kirk Meyer, the building number he worked in, the site area. So okay, he's working for Kirk Meyer, and Kirk Meyer, if you look up their old ads, you'll see ads. They were formerly called Rolltech, and you'll see like old ads where they list the type of roles that they were after, and they're all technical roles. You know, where an electronic technician would fit straight in. Not physicists. I've never seen anything from them saying that they want a physicist. So he's working for this Kirk Meyer group, who only, from the surface of it, only seem to be hiring technical roles, who are formerly called Rolltech, and he's working for them. Now, SignalsIntelligence did some investigation. I obtained an old copy of the Lanel phone directory at one point. I wanted to know what the Lanel phone directory looks like. These are my Bob notes. There you go. Names, numbers, and the agency people work for. The building they worked for, the site they worked for. It's what it looks like. But that's an old one from 1980, and Bob's not in it. So he's not there in 1980, I know that. So we then went out and got other versions, and we did some follow requests, and there's another person you don't know. I don't think I've ever spoken about him that I was working with. Well, you know, he got interested in Bob Lazar as well. He did a lot of these follow requests, which was quite interesting, because I think at one point the nuclear energy department came back and said, "Oh, why do you want this?" And he's like, "Well, we're just looking at Bob Lazar," and they're like, "Oh, okay." But we got a version of it, but he got a version, and this is the interesting thing, that comes out like every month or every quarter or something like that, regularly, and that phone directory. But we got like a month before or a couple of months before Bob was actually in it. So he wasn't there again, even in 1982, in the earlier months of 1982. Mm-hmm. So we had to do another FOA request, which took absolutely ages to get out. And I think if you've ever done a FOA, you know how long it takes to get responses. But then it goes back, and we get more, and then SignalsIntelligence does some requests, and we work out that, just judging by the directories we get, that he wasn't there very long, sort of like around 6 months. And there's all these stories. I don't know if you could read up SignalsIntelligence research, but there's stories about why he wasn't there for very long. But I mean, you can read up about that. So yeah, and then so there's all that, but then he's still portrayed as a physicist. Why? Because he's put forth the LA Monitor newspaper article that said he was a physicist. So the LA Monitor article was about his jet car, and that's very important. It's not about him. It's not about him being a physicist. It's not about Lanel. It's about this guy who was racing around in a jet car, who built his own Honda jet car. Okay, that's the focus of the story. In that story, it just notes him saying, "Oh, and Bob's a physicist." Okay, so then Jeremy Corbell goes on Joe Rogan, I think it was, and he says, "Well, I contacted the author of that article, and he told me," and he said his name was Terry English, and he said, "Oh, he'd be blackballed by the whole Lanel community," you know, sort of alluding that if he got that wrong about Bob being a physicist and all this sort of stuff. So, okay, I tried to contact this guy. His name, well, I'll leave that off for a bit. I finally, after ages, and I had to find a friend of his who actually then got me his contact. He was a very hard man to get in contact with. It took me absolutely ages. If I was saying 6 months, I wouldn't be lying. I finally got in contact with him, and he's really hesitant to talk about it. He's like, I don't want anything to do with any of that shit anymore, sort of that sort of attitude. And first of all, he's written science fiction novels, so I thought, okay, whatever. And but it doesn't go down that path. You know, you have that worry. Okay, he's written science fiction novels. Is he going to go down the same? Oh yeah, Bob Lazar, it's true. Yeah. But he didn't go down that path. I sent him the transcript of what Jeremy Corbell had said. You know, what I just mentioned before, and he said, "No, I never checked with Bob. I never checked at Bob. I never checked with Lannel that if he was a physicist there. I just took Bob's word for it. And I don't remember anything. I don't remember telling Jeremy Corbell anything like I would have been blackballed by Lannel. I don't know where he got that. Well, yeah, I never said that, basically.
So Bob was working there in the early 80s at Lannel, right, for a time. But then
82.
82. So but when George Knapp got hold of the story, or when he was promoting the story in the late 80s, he says that him and Bob would go to Lannel and they just sort of let him through. Like he would give like a kind of a tour of the facility. So did they remember Bob or something? Or was he still doing stuff for them?
Well, there's always that story going around, isn't there, that you know that he was testing or fixing alpha radiation probes,
Yeah.
which is a famous story about why he still had a contract with them. Is it true? Who knows? But could they have just let him in because he worked there? Who knows? I have no idea. But the interesting thing about that was George Knapp had this video where he, like that story he broke, where he said that Bob or whoever took him through Lannel.
Yeah.
The interesting thing about that is he says, well, here's this here's the particle accelerator that Bob worked on. And he shows this picture of this horseshoe machine. That's, I forget what it's called. It's not a particle accelerator. It's something else, because I did a reverse image search and found that
Cyclotron?
it's a proton. It's like when they try to image things at a deep level.
Oh.
Yeah. So that was interesting. And so maybe he met something else that was in the background, maybe, but he was actually, well, I'm pretty sure he's referring to that machine, but whatever. He's not a scientist. We'll let him go on that. It did sort of make me think, oh, did they lie to him? I don't know. But maybe, I think the linear accelerator is near that area or even runs into that machine. So maybe he was trying to talk about that. So give him a pass or whatever. Anyway, but in no stage of that little video clip he shows, do you ever see anyone? There's no one in it. You just see the machine. You don't see George. You don't see Bob. You don't see anyone. The only thing you see is like a little corner. I can see my camera now. I'll use my left hand. That someone's hand sort of creeps in at the bottom corner. That's it. Or something to that effect. And at that point, George wasn't as big as he is now, if you like. And he was still talking to people, and I DM'd him on Facebook, and he responded. Actually, he responded a few times to my questions. And I said, well, I said, I noticed that that video clip has got no one in it. Do you have like any footage where you're in it or Bob's in it? He goes, oh yeah, I'm sure we do. And I said, oh, can get it? No, he sort of goes by, and I sort of ask again, I think it was. And he goes, look, I don't have time to dig up every bit of footage. And every time I asked him for more information like that, I always got that sort of response.
Yeah.
So I just gave up. But yeah, so you would have seen the signal. You know, if people want to learn more, there's your write-up, a big write-up as well, is what I wrote up on Reddit. And Signal Intelligence wrote up a few things where, his interviews with the people at Lannel. And I think John Horn also, who's a friend of Bob, who loaned him some money to put a deposit on a jet car. Bob bought that jet car, or that particular jet car. He loaned him $2,000. It was a small amount. It was just for the deposit of the car. And that was the money he chased Bob for some time to try and get back off him. And there's that interview with, is it Mark or Michael? Mark Farmer, with John Horn talking, where he talks about that, the money he loaned Bob for that deposit on the jet car. And he also mentions that he believed that Bob was a technician at Lannel. So you got a few sources saying that he was a technician there. You've got the LA Monitor guy who only had Bob's word that he was a physicist, never checked. Well, he said he didn't check. And then you have Krangle.
Yeah.
Richard Krangle, who only thought Bob was a physicist there because he looked like one.
Yeah.
Solid evidence there.
He also claimed that he had attended a security meeting or briefing, but that could have just been like a security thing about like what to do in an emergency, right? Like,
that's right. I said that to someone else actually recently. You must have read my mind, but yeah, I mean, security meeting could be anything. It'd be like, hey man, just remember to close the door behind you. Don't let anyone in when you come in with your pass. Don't hold the door open for anyone. Like, it could be anything.
yeah.
But, whatever, whoever. But so what if he was at a security meeting? What does that even mean? The interesting thing about Richard, is it Richard Krangle, is that he's an electronics type of physicist, which is he's not a theoretical physicist or like what you presume to be the classical type of physicist. He's like an electronics physicist. And he had a company, because I did some research on him, and a company that, you're not going to believe this, but his company tested electronic equipment, calibrated it.
Mm-hmm.
I thought at the time, there's this electronics guy, he's testing equipment, and he's calibrating testing equipment, and he knew Bob, the electronic technician guy. Is that so out of the ordinary? No.
What about United Nuclear? When was that established? Do we know?
Oh, look at me, really picking my mind on dates. Probably, like, I found the old documentation, and I know at one point in the early time, and maybe we've discussed this as well, Gene Huff owned half of United Nuclear, which is very, very strange. Why does Gene Huff own half of it? But who knows? Maybe he just put in the money for it. But as you know, Gene Huff also produced that Bob Lazar, the government Bible, or whatever it's called, that video about, where Bob's talking about his story, where they try to sell for $30 a pop. But of course, he never made money off his story. People just forget all that.
Yeah. Was do you
know
think that
the interesting thing? Well, maybe I shouldn't say, because I'm not completely sure, but I think at one point that Bob Lazar website, which I think was set up by John Farhat from Newline, because as people may not know, Bob Lazar sold his the movie rights to his story to Newline Cinema.
Yeah.
And it wasn't the first, actually. The first was Cooper Peters. Then that rolled over because I don't think they did anything with it. Then Newline picked it up, and oh man, I forgot the third. There was actually a third. I think Newline was right in the middle. Yeah, there is three. I forget the third one. Yeah, but John Farhat, I'm pretty sure it was him, created that website for Bob. And at one point, I think it was had a section where they were charging you to see his information or something like that, some exclusive. Not sure, so don't take that with a grain of salt. But I know early on his website that he was selling his merch and stuff associated with his story. So, you know, then he also had for a short while his own radio show, UFO Line, because he's not a UFO guy at all. You know, the horse shit you hear online about Bob Lazar, he was, you know, when I hear the Bob Lazar streamlined story and I don't know about the story, and it's just like, he was never into UFOs, and then, why was he doing a UFO radio show there? And he wasn't making money. Why was he selling merch? Why did he make a videotape and then advertise, you know, have a company, Tridot, wasn't it? Yeah, Tridot was the company Gene Huff and Bob Lazar started, and then they were selling that videotape under $30 a pop, which is about $90 or $60 today. And then he had a deal with testers to make that UFO model, which I heard, it's a rumor, but I heard he got a royalty for. I'm sure he didn't do it for free. So yeah, there's all that, and there's his book. You got all those appearances. I heard he got paid pretty, to do that Nippon TV thing at least.
Yeah.
Because there was that controversy about him not turning up and not returning the money, allegedly. Even though he did ring in, so yeah, they still interviewed him, I suppose. But he wasn't there as they wanted him to be. So yeah, there's all those sort of things. So yeah, I'm rambling a bit. I forget. I'm rambling on so long that I forget what you even asked me.
I was asking about United Nuclear.
Oh, right. Okay.
Because I was wondering, I guess my question was, did Bob kind of use his UFO story as a kind of way to promote United Nuclear to make it successful? Or was it already successful?
Yeah, you could take that. I mean, if you're in the media and people know you as a UFO guy, and you're now selling that mugs with E115 on them or whatever he did. But even if he's just selling normal stuff, they're going to want to find out, self-promotion, that people want to know you, or it's going to help whatever you do. Basically, you could have sold Fakari rugs and it would have helped him. You know what I mean? Because just
do you reckon that was his main motivation, was to make money, or do you think it was something else?
No, I just look. A lot of people ask that question: why did he do it? I think it was just no one knows. You can only guess. I'm just guessing that maybe it was just one of those things. He met John Lear, the way John Lear was and believed in all these UFO stories. Maybe he just told John Lear the story and it just snowballed from there. Because as you know, I think John Lear's the one who then said, let's talk to George Knapp, and got him on, basically. So then there was a whole bit where he sort of did the interview and he was trying to wrestle the tape away from George Knapp. Remember that story?
Mm-hmm.
So I think at that point there was that line that was being crossed, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And you kind of get the impression that, you're only speculating, but who knows? It just sort of seems like it snowballed. Who knows? Yeah, so that's how I see it.
Is there an Australian version of Lazar that you can think of?
Sort of. There's a guy named, I forget his name. Well, I'm really bad with names, but his name will come back to me. Speaking of bad with names, when Terry England came back to me about what Jeremy Corbell had said. One of the things, the first thing he said was, well, first of all, or one of the things he said was, yeah, well, one of the points, I think it was he's got my name wrong for a start. My name's not Terry English, it's Terry England. That was interesting. But anyway, I digress. But yeah, there was this guy that sort of had this weird story, but not Bob Lazar type. It was sort of funny enough. I think he actually rang into a radio show early in the day and actually spoke to Bob, because I were on the radio and I remember this guy's voice, and I remember, oh, that's that guy that's this Aussie guy. He's trying to tie in his story. He was trying to tie in his story to Bob, like sort of tangentially. Which is another frustrating thing that happens with these UFO stories, isn't it? Is that when this UFO story comes out, it's big, you'll get these hanger-ons, and they'll try to make up some shit and try to hang it on. And then people will say, oh, see, it's true, because he's also saying, and that ties in. People don't understand human nature. So, yeah, because then there was also that bit about, and Dan Benkert would have told you this one about, which he told me anyway, was the similarities between the Demon Core story and Bob's alien reactor, and how they look pretty much the same.
Yeah.
And the core of the story is pretty much the same. I mean, the Demon Core story is where they had this ad hoc reactor they were using to test things or whatever. And, he opened this metal hemisphere, or semi-hemisphere, or whatever. And some reason he was holding it open with a screwdriver, and he let it slip, and then it closed, and it went critical for a split second until he opened it again. And then some of them died. Some of the scientists died. And this happened at Lanor as well, I think. And Bob's story was this reactor, they had this alien reactor that surprisingly looked like the Demon Core. Wow. They tried to cut into it and they died. So slightly different. But yeah, there's always all those sort of things where you can look at all these different stories going around and piece them together. And you can see if someone was going to come up with that story, how they would have pieced it together.
Are there any UFO cases that you think are genuinely anomalous, or that you would think there might be something weird going on behind them, which is not earthly?
No. And I might have at one point, where I sort of started to get into the UFO when I saw Bob Lazar's story. But when you start exploring more and more and more with a genuine curiosity and not trying to debunk them, but just curious, and you realize, and all the red flags start flying out, and then you do another one, and the same thing happens, that's when you get really disillusioned. Like, I even spoke to Mike Rogers, the guy that's friends and was the crew boss of Travis Walton. Actually spoke to him at one point. He actually put out a post on Facebook saying, something to the effect that, he said that Travis Walton was a UFO hoaxer, straight up.
Yeah.
And then there was that bit about him going with that Ryan guy and supposedly admitting it, all this sort of stuff. And I dug into that and I found the original guy that polygraphed Travis Walton, who said that he was, according to him, was deceptive. There was no doubt about it. Saucer Watch, or whatever that UFO group was called at the time, also did a report saying, not good. So even pro UFO groups are saying, at the time, when you look at the original research, was saying, yeah. So just went through all that, and then Charlie Weiser picked that up, and I gave her, that's how I met Charlie Weiser. Was I mentioned that I'd interviewed Mike Rogers, and she came back and said, "Oh, did you? Or can I hear that?" And that's how I met Charlie Weiser, believe it or not. And so she did all that deep dive on Travis, and I was all there, just sort of talking to her through all that. I even spoke to Ryan Gordon at one point. That was an interesting phone call. Oh my goodness. Me and Charlie had a disagreement about that. I remember that. She, yeah, I won't get into that either. For the same reasons as before, but red flags were popping up. But then I thought, well, I'll do a deep dive in an Australian case, and that's when I did look in an Australian case, and that was when I looked at Westall.
Yeah.
And I thought, oh well, that's fascinating because I don't know. I grew up. My family home was only less than a mile. Oops. Yeah, my family home was less than a mile from where the Westall event took place, so that's why it took my interest. And I thought, really, UFOs in Westall? Come on. So I did, but it really interested me. So I thought maybe there's something to this one. And I did dive into that, and I chatted online to some witnesses, some of the students who are old, they're older than me now. And that's when and I sort of did a dive into it, and the wheels started to fall off real fast. The only thing, if you've ever watched Westall 66, there's some like this, oh gosh. It's impossible to say anything about the Westall case unless you're going to really just rip into some of the witnesses like big time. Let me just say this, that the only thing that I could corroborate is that they saw something in the sky. What it was, some say they think maybe it was an alien craft, and there are at least 3 witnesses that I know of, and at least one of them I spoke to, on Facebook anyway, chat, that said they thought it was a balloon. So it's interesting, isn't it? And here's a really interesting, I've told the story many times, but he said he went to a reunion with all the other Westall kids, being not kids now, they're probably 60s. And, they're all telling this, oh, yeah, I thought it was an alien. Yeah, it was a normal UAP or whatever. And he's there, and the TV crew come to him, and he's like, yeah, I thought it was a balloon. And they're like, that's ufology in a nutshell.
Yeah.
The media. UFOs sell, balloons don't.
So maybe I'll finish on this note. What's your solution to the Fermi paradox?
I mean, there's so many unknown variables in that, so there should be alien life, really. I mean, but that's based on that equation, which has people have plugged in just guesses, so it's no better than a guess. So what are we even talking about? Some guess. But yeah, I mean, however, that said, if there are aliens around, why can't we see them? Yeah. Like at one point I used to think, one point I had this thought, well, aliens that come here, what would they do? They would put something to monitor us, and the best place would be like a satellite or something on the moon. So, because we've always got that one face of the moon pointing to us, be perfect, wouldn't it? And then I saw that thing about the Black Knight satellite. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
And then I saw that was probably bullshit. And then they don't really see anything on the moon, and so, but yeah, it is odd. I mean, if there are aliens, why aren't they there? Why aren't they? It sort of leads you to that next thing. If they are here and they did visit Earth, then they're deliberately not making themselves known. So you've got this, it then jumps. It's sort of like they did come to Earth, but they're not making themselves known, or they didn't. So just these logic sort of way, just thinking about it, you just go down these logical channels, you know what I mean? So which is interesting, sort of alludes that, if they did come here, if they are, then they're not making themselves known, that's for sure. So I guess my only thoughts on that, really. I did do a video actually about the Fermi paradox, now that I think about it. So not the Fermi paradox, but just how few stars there are around our sun and us. Because people always say, oh, well, if there's life out there just by the numbers, then surely they'll come here. But what people don't realize is how few the stars are in even remotely what you'd consider close proximity to us. I think within like 100 light years or 50 light years, there's something like 5,000 stars or what, not a lot. When you're talking about, the trillions or whatever, the trillions or whatever that must exist in the universe. But when you look at it locally, there's not a hell of a lot. And then half of those, or, a great chunk of those wouldn't bear life anyway because they're red dwarfs or some other type of star. To just not, would just not be applicable to, say, having planets which would have life. So then you start chopping it down, and then it's sort of like in the thousands. Then you would say, what are the odds of a planet with intelligent life coming from just a few thousand stars? And it's negligible, But then again, you're just guessing because you don't know how common life could be. But just when you go down that path of thought, you're thinking, well, if life is out there, it must really, the odds are it must come from thousands, if not tens, if not hundreds of thousands of light years away. You know what I mean? Not 100 light years away, which is extremely remote. And if it's coming from that far away, the only way they could do it, even if it was 100 light, even if it was 50 light years, they would need technology that could propel them much, much, much faster than the speed of light, effectively. We're talking, then even if it was 100 light years away, it's not, and they were traveling at light speed, it would take 100 years just to get here and then 100 years back. I mean, would they send the probe? Oh, maybe, but with alien life on it. So if they are coming, if this alien life is coming, then it leads you to that next step. Then you need to sort of start acknowledging that they've got technology that can drive their ship probably thousands of times faster than the speed of light effectively, because you can't travel through space at the speed of light, because you break Einstein's rules. And you're testing my physics. I'll let you know a little bit of something about me. I did a double major degree. I double majored in computer science and physics. But all the physics stuff is gone because I got into computer science. So I wouldn't call myself a physicist because I forget most of that. I wouldn't have a clue. All those equations, writing sheets and sheets on quantum mechanics. Oh my gosh, what a nightmare. Anyway, the thing with physics is that, when you go into Einstein stuff, is that as you get faster and faster and faster, and it's sort of like a logarithmic thing, your mass increases and the amount of energy you would take to go faster increases to the point where when you get close, to not in the 90s or something, it just becomes impossible. And in fact, according to Einstein's equations, your mass would become, to get to light speed, you would need an infinite amount of energy, and your mass would also become infinite. And it's an impossibility to travel through space to get to light speed. That's what his equations tell you. And so it then goes into, well, perhaps they have a bubble of space, that bubble of space is traveling through space and is not violating Einstein's laws because the local area of space they're not moving. Space can travel through space perhaps at faster than the speed of light. Then it gets to science that is way out there, you know what I mean? So is that true? Can that happen? Maybe. I'd like to think it's possible.
Anything else you want to add about the Lazar story or anything else?
The other person I did interview was Glenn Campbell, and I've not released that interview. That's actually quite sad, pretty much ashamed of that one, to be honest. Because when I interviewed him, he said, "Oh, please send me a copy of it," and then I just didn't do anything with it, didn't send him a copy of it, and then he passed away. So I feel feel pretty bad about that one, actually. The only thing that he told me in that of great interest, I suppose. Wow. Yeah, I don't know if I should say that. Maybe I'll release it one day, but he did say something about getting a phone call from Bob, about Bob telling him he had a photo of him. Yeah, maybe I'll release it, but it's only going to be that bit of information. It was really interesting. It was more or less just him talking about how he started in Area 51, and then I think he ended up doing tours of Area 51, and he wrote that booklet about the Area 51 Viewer's Guide. He talked about meeting Gene Huff at one point at his, I think it was at his business, where he did house appraisals, and having an encounter with Gene Huff. And yeah, he mentioned he told me that he was at Rachel 93 as well, where they did that. Bob Lazar did that Q&A, and the other thing that sticks out to me in terms of remembering what he said is that he told me that Bob Lazar rang him and had a conversation with Bob Lazar. That was it. Other than that, it was just his general sort of life and how he got into looking into Area 51 and all that sort of stuff. Yeah, very sad he passed away. I had no idea, to be honest. I thought, like, I knew he was sick, knew he had cancer, but there was this point after that that I thought he was in remission. I don't know why, but then I thought, oh, maybe thinking that he was in remission, maybe I'll ask him for an interview. And he did give me an interview. But then later, yeah, he passed away, and I realized that, yeah, that he'd come back and he died from it. He actually had, I don't know if you know this, I think it's okay for me to say, but he had leading edge therapy to try and cure his cancer. It's just where they get your cells, was it stem cells, he said? They get your cells and they take them from you, and they genetically alter them or something, and then they inject them back into you. It was leading edge and cost a shitload of money, he was telling me, and he went and he got that done, but I was quite hopeful that was going to work. And no, but it didn't.
Unfortunate.
But it was, I guess it was interesting from that point, from a science point, that they were at that level sort of thing. The more you dive into Lazar's story, it's interesting from an exploration kind of level. Even the non-UFO stuff, you would have seen what Signal Intelligence put out about, the prior life to his UFO stuff. So very colorful sort of background.
It's got something for everyone.
Yes, got the works. It was all, yeah. It was interesting how he got into fireworks, and he was into running that Desert Blast show in the desert every year, and that was going on. That was started before his S4 story, wasn't it? So yeah, doing a lot of things. But yeah, what can you say about it? Bob Lazar? I'll say something very interesting. Well, not interesting, but what I've always thought is Bob Lazar's story is not about Bob Lazar. And that's a very odd thing to say, I know. Bob Lazar's, and let me explain, Bob Lazar's story, let me put it this way. There's a lot of people saying stories in the world every day. Right? Some of them are really intricate. You know people, I'm sure you know, maybe even relatives that like to tell stories. I used to have a friend that used to tell some whoppers that he was in the special forces or something, and he murdered someone with a knife at one point. He was telling me all this stuff. I actually believed him. At one point, I did believe him. Very elaborate story too. And but we all know people like that. Lots of people like that. There's lots of people like that. There's lots of people telling UFO stories all the time, but they never become big or in the media, and they don't last. So why is Bob Lazar's story different? And his story is different because he got picked up by the media, and certain people in the media kept pushing it for all these years. That's the true nature of Bob Lazar's story. And if you look at some of the nucleus of that, and I don't know if you've got any more time, but there's a little bit more I could add on. Not so much with Bob Lazar, but when George Knapp met Bob Lazar, he spoke to Harry Reid. Yeah, that Harry Reid. And if you read the Rolling Stones article, Harry Reid sort of alluded that it was George Knapp that got him into UFOs. And it also had some interesting quotes there. That he also said that they came to an agreement where they would horse trade UFO information between George Knapp and Harry Reid. This is going back decades. And this all happened after the Bob Lazar story. And then George Knapp introduced Harry Reid to Bob Bigelow. And then now you've got all three. You can see where the nucleus of this, what's happening today, all started. It's all happened way back then, in the early, 1990 roughly, when they all came together and met, all through George Knapp. And then that ended up with ORSAP, through Bigelow and Reid. And then George reported on it, wrote the book, Skinwalker Ranch, which was associated with that. And then the Lou Elizondos come in, and Eric Davis coming into Skinwalker Ranch. You know what I mean? The man is in the center of a lot of shit.
Yeah, that's true.
So much so that people don't even realize what's going on today had a nucleus way back then. And guess who's in the middle of it?
Yeah, that's a good point.
At one point, he said on a radio show in the early days that he said that light traveled instantaneously. He said gravity waves travel instantaneously. Now we know they don't. They travel at light speed. That was one interesting thing. The other thing he said was bringing up the Russians. Remember he said that story that he was told, or was in the documents he read, that Russian scientists were at S4?
Yeah. Doesn't make sense. That was the Cold War.
And, no, I know, but so you've got the secret base Area 51 that are developing, was it the U2 that was there?
Yeah.
Where they've got these secret spy craft they're spying on Russia with, that they want to keep totally secret from Russia. And what, these guys are flying into Area 50, these Russians. When you look at his story like that, it's so ridiculous. You wonder, how in fuck did anyone even believe this shit? Forget the analysis and the deep dive into researching it. When you look at those sort of things, you think, holy fuck, what was I even thinking? This is so ridiculous. Russian scientists going into area, to get to S4. Russian scientists flying to Area 51 and then taking a bus to S4, which is the way he said was the way to get there. And then you hear stories from, say, T.D. Barnes, where they're so worried about just keeping this stuff secret at Area 51 secret from the Russians that they knew the timetable for Russian satellites going over, so that when the satellites were about to come over, they would shove everything back in the hangars so they couldn't see shit. And here's this story, like Russian scientists are coming. Come on.
Yeah.
Or the other story was, of course, the one I love. This one. Bob was so worried that the government was going to come for him that, and this is a story George Knapp tells, that he had a piece of element fit E115 in front of his home particle accelerator, was it?
Yeah.
And Bob was going to press the button if they came for him or whatever, and it would have, and according to Knapp, would have left a huge hole into Las Vegas. Okay, so let's think about that logically. So George Knapp, if he believes him, thinks this guy's got a device which could take out a big chunk of Vegas. What does he do about it? Nothing. You know, you'd think, like someone tells you they're a scientist and you believe they're a scientist. Let's put it this way. And you believe they're a physicist. And you believe they worked at Lanol, where they developed the bomb, you know, part of, and then they tell you, just as an analogy, they tell you that they've made a crude nuclear bomb that can wipe out a huge section of Vegas. And you go, and you believe this, and you go, all right, interesting. Did he tell the police? Who knows? Did he report it? I don't remember him, you know, other than saying, you know, down the track that that's what happened.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? You know, it's those sort of stories that you think, oh, for fuck's sake.
Mhm. The other thing is that when they raided his business, which they made a big deal about in the Corbell documentary, they didn't send the Department of Energy, who would absolutely have been involved, like if there was like nuclear material which could blow up a city.
Yeah, I mean, you know, they were after apparently that thallium
Yeah.
that was used to kill someone. But I mean, it's not. But before that, he'd been arrested, and
Yeah.
I don't think they raided him before about all the other materials that he was selling. You know, because he had that, was it fireworks material that he was, you know, materials that he was selling illegally, supposedly. I don't know if he got off or how that went. I forget now. But
Made a fine.
it wasn't the first time, you
Yeah.
know. And he did sell firework stuff, and there is that history. I don't think he denies it either, of him doing all that firework stuff. And that was interesting with Signal Intelligence. I think there was that bit in his write-up where he talks about that. I'm not sure if he, maybe I'm talking out of turn because I know he edited it after I read it. I'm not sure if he left it in, but he talked to someone about, yeah, all the fireworks history. It was quite interesting how we got into it. And oh yes, it was his friend. His friend talked about the firework history, how he
Yeah.
grew up with Bob, like from his early years, and how Bob got into fireworks and stuff, which is quite interesting. But yeah, so there is that. So it's not like this is not like his business wouldn't have been on the radar for, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But I mean, I did think it was a bit weird though, you know. But that's what it's like, isn't it? It's America. I'm not sure that would happen in Australia, but you know, you always see these stories and people get swatted, you know, and they're playing video games and someone says he's got a bomb, and then, you know, you would have seen online, and then, you know, 100 SWAT troops turn up to this poor guy who's just playing Call of Duty or something. Forget Bob's UFO story. I think his real life story would make a good movie.
Yep, for sure.
100%.
Who would play him?
They tried to get Matt Damon at one point. I think it was for New Line, wasn't it?
Yeah, yeah.
But one of the 3 movie producers tried to make a movie out of his story, but they kept letting it go. And I vaguely remember, maybe this is just rumor, that they got wind of all the, you know, the brothel stuff, and then they just went, no, they just sort of passed off and went after another. Maybe that's just a rumor, but yeah. So yeah, it would be interesting if what if they made a movie of his life story, like his real life story. It's
Yeah.
so many interesting things as a drama, sort of. aspect of it, and what's happened in his life in the past, and all this sort of stuff. Because he had that. The other thing that doesn't get spoken about much is the business he had with his wife, producing, processing photos and doing parcels or something. And then they gave, geez, I'm trying not to talk out of turn because I'm not remembering what Signal Intelligence has put out there, but there's information about that he found that was quite interesting. It was called Studio West, and Signal, he found a news clipping about it and what had happened with that. Nothing serious, but it was just interesting to see a news clipping about that business actually was real. Because you always wonder about these things. Was it real? Studio West, yeah, it was real, at least according to this clipping. Yeah, so there was that other aspect of Bob's life, that there was this other business that he was also, at least with his wife, had. So yeah, Corbell Lazar is I don't know what to say about that story.
It's a crazy story. I wasn't expecting Hell's Angels to be part of the Lazar story, but here we are.
Yeah, I've known that for quite a while because obviously Signal talks to me for quite a bit. But yeah, it was hard to accept. Not hard to accept. It was. You always picture yourself as Carol for a long time as the victim in this. You know what I mean? And in a way, and that's still not possibly untrue in terms of what happened after. But I don't know. But yeah, the whole thing with Carol passing away, with the getting the death certificate, and Signal also got the coroner's report, and there was the police report. What Bob said in his book about her. I think in his book he said that she had cancer and that's why she killed herself. But there's no mention of that in the coroner's report, I can tell you that. And they had the medical records for Carol, apparently, if I remember right. He also says that when Carol died, that I think he was away on errands. I think that's what he says in his autobiography. But in the police report, he told the police that he was away racing cars. And then you've got what actually happened, according to the marriage certificates, was that he was actually away marrying Tracy, who worked for their photo processing company. There's 3 different things. So a lot of different things like that, don't get brought up much, but it's all very interesting. And the fact that he was racing those jet cars, and I found an ad one time where it was at a race meet, I think, and it said, and Bob Lazar will be there showing his jet car. It was a newspaper clipping. It was interesting. It was all the sort of past life things that he'd got into. Yeah, good for him. At least you could say he had an interesting life. But I don't think he was. A lot of people, some people, there was also the story that said that maybe he worked at Area 51, and the Eric Davis piece where he said maybe Bob Lazar worked off-site, not at Area 51, but some off-site facility. I don't believe that at all. Not at all. And as I told someone today, if that was true, he would have some kind of proof or something, and he would have worked that into his story. Like, here's my badge from Area 51 or something. They've probably taken it away, but there must be something. You know what I mean? If he actually did work at Area 51, I just imagine he would have worked that into the story.
Yes.
And just saying he worked at S4, which is just somewhere else. He would have said, oh, yes, I did work at Area 51. And I know. Anyway, I just don't believe that bit. And and then that gets turned into a Chinese whisper, because I'm pretty sure Chris Mellon got that off Eric Davis, and then he said the same story. His friend told him, which I thought he was referring to Eric Davis, and he repeated the same story, but then left out the bit that seemingly left out the bit where Eric says that he was offsite, not at Area 51, but offsite. He just said Area 51. So then it becomes this Chinese whisperer. To me, if Eric Davis was the one that told him that anyway, if that's the case, then it sort of becomes this Chinese whisper. And you get a lot of that online. The other day I was just talking about it. Someone was said, made this post, and they got all upvoted for it. And they said that actual reality, Bob Lazar didn't get arrested and 150 hours community service because of running a brothel. It was because he put cameras outside that videoed people coming in and out of the brothel, not in the trick rooms, but people coming in and out of the brothel. And that's illegal. That's what he got pinged for. And they got upvoted for that. Total bullshit. And I said, I commented, and I said, no, he got arrested and pled guilty for pandering. Not, he put up, you know, I'm sure he did put, you know, there was that bit of putting up cameras, but that's not what he got arrested and pled guilty for. And I got downvoted to that. So, you know, it's just so ridiculous. It just has a life of its own and just morphs into all these different things. Even on the negative side, you get some stories that you have to double check. Like there was a story that came out that I mentioned this before, that Bob's first wife Carol's social security number was on his W-2, which it turned out to be not true. But that was a story that was sort of used to discredit the W-2. So it's hard, but you've got to be fair and true and honest when you find that that's not true and say so.
Yep.
So sometimes you have to take that step, even though something's out there that might look, if you're painting a picture from the evidence you've found that says, you know, maybe the story isn't accurate, and you find this other story about this SSN, it sounds good and you might want to add it, but you've got to be true to yourself and say, okay, no, I found that isn't the case. It is actually his SSN. So there's always that aspect. So yeah, there's all this, his story over the years is just all over the place. You really got to dig down and find the original information and put it back together. You know, it feels like when you come from, as I did, like you're grabbing all these different little pieces and you're just trying to put it all back together again. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Pieces that were there as a whole back in the day. Nice to meet you, and yeah, have a good night.
Cheers, matey.
Okay. Bye.
See you.